going to talk about an issue that's key to dating and intimate partnership, and that's consent. So we're going to talk about the way we think about our relationships, the presumptions we've been raised with that affect how we communicate, and some myths that we have as a society regarding virginity and human sexuality. It's important to me that we start this discussion on the same page, coming from a shared perspective. So I looked at your student handbook and found that we do share some important values. And I want those values to be the foundation of our time together today. Honesty, integrity, and respect for the unique dignity of each person. It's my intention to present these materials honestly and with integrity and respect. I'm far from perfect, and there will almost certainly be something that I say that you disagree with, maybe even strongly disagree with. And I hope that you'll feel comfortable enough to raise your concerns and questions in the question and answer time that's going to follow the PowerPoint presentation. I'm willing to stay on the line as long as you'll have me, and I invite you to email me with anything you think of even after our time together today concludes. So even when two people respect each other and are committed to honesty and integrity, communicating clearly about sex and relationships is still very difficult in our culture. For more than a decade, I worked as a deputy prosecuting attorney and handled hundreds of sexual assault cases. And I noticed something, especially where the victim and the perpetrator knew each other, were friends or had dated, they started from very different places. The victim believed that the answer was no until she said yes. And even then, the yes was limited to that specific time, place, and act. Yes means yes, but until I actually say yes, the answer is no. The perpetrators started from a completely different place. They assumed that the answer was yes until she said no. And not just said no, but really definitely meant it. And even if no means no, that no is always negotiable. And so they would persist and keep pushing the victim, trying to get her to relent. When it comes to engaging in any consensual sexual conduct, yes means yes, and no means no sounds like two sides of the same coin, but they have very different underlying presumptions. And part of the presumptions and assumptions we have come from what we were taught about sex growing up. The messages we receive from media, TV, movies, and also what we were not taught growing up. What you think and your experience up until today can vary greatly depending upon the family, community, and the state you grew up in. So we're going to take an honest look at some of these things today. What do we think about virginity, and why do we think that? What makes a man a real man? What makes a woman a real woman? And what has our society and culture taught us? So let's start by defining consent. When we want to know the meaning of a word, the first place we generally look is the dictionary. Here's a simple dictionary definition of consent. It all boils down to an agreement or permission. Now that may sound very simple to you, but as a lawyer, I can assure you it's not. I spent an entire semester during my first year of law school studying contracts, which are nothing more than agreements. So when I look at that definition, I see three very important elements in order for there to be consent. You have to have capacity to consent. There has to be an action. It has to be active, not passive. And then there has to be some relationship between the person giving the consent and receiving the consent, making the agreement. So we'll talk about those in a little bit, but first, since we're talking about consent in the context of dating and intimate partnership, we also need to talk about sex organs. So let me just say the words: penis and vagina. When it comes to sex, the first things we all learn is that boys have a penis and girls have a vagina. Not everybody is comfortable using those words, and I have heard literally hundreds of different names for these body parts. When I was a kid growing up, I learned all the body parts except those two. Seriously, you know the song Head and Shoulders, Knees and Toes? Eyes and ears and mouth and nose. Well, there wasn't anything that we named between the shoulders and the knees, except maybe the belly and the belly button. I wasn't even allowed to say the word butt growing up. We had friends from church whose last name was Butt, and my mother absolutely could not bring herself to say it. And I remember talking to one of my best friends at school who said something about a Dobby. So this was back in the 1900s before Harry Potter. And I remember asking him what the heck he was talking about. And he said, you know, boys have a Dobby and girls have a Molly Gobbler. I did not know that. So think about what you were told growing up. How many different slang terms did you and your friends use for those body parts? How many do you still use? Anyway, I went off to college totally unprepared to have a meaningful discussion about any consensual behavior that might include those body parts. And it turns out this not talking about it actually perpetuates male aggression and female shaming and blaming. We have to move beyond our discomfort and talk honestly with our partners about our body parts and sexuality. I did learn about reproduction in biology. Most of you have probably seen these two diagrams of the male and female reproductive organs. Reproduction is very binary. It requires a male sperm and a female egg. It does not require any social relationship between the individuals producing the sperm and the egg, and it does not require consent. One of the biggest reasons most of us haven't learned much about consent growing up is that our schools didn't teach it. Schools primarily teach biological reproduction in the context of heterosexual marriage, and they teach abstinence prior to marriage, which is fine, but there is no relationship light switch that turns on when you get married and suddenly enlightens you on what a healthy relationship looks like or prepares you to talk about and communicate with your partner. So teens turn to their peers, and way too many turn to porn. Look again at the female anatomy parts that are labeled. They are all only internal organs. The vagina is actually just the birth canal. If you're not a gynecologist, you'll probably go your entire life without ever seeing a vagina, even if you have one. And calling everything down there a vagina actually isn't very helpful when it comes to intimacy and human sexuality. And here's something I found really disturbing when I first realized it. Reproduction, I mean, if you don't count cloning or test tube babies, but reproduction requires a man's pleasure and a woman's pain. As a female, it's mind-boggling to realize that for the human race to continue on this planet, men must have the pleasure of orgasm and women must bear the pain of childbirth. Different cultures and religions deal with this fact differently, but it's certainly an underlying factor in every patriarchal society. Reproduction requires absolutely no pleasure and no orgasm where women are concerned, so schools don't teach it. We talk about the penis and its function in reproduction, but there is no need to talk about the clitoris. And I would venture to say that no one's parents or teachers ever told them boys have a penis and girls have a clitoris. Human sexuality and intimate relationships are not just about reproduction, and it's not binary. Let me show you a diagram of the real sex organ. So there it is. The diagram is the same regardless of your reproductive anatomy. And despite the fact that this is the most intimate, private, and personal of all of our body parts, very few people are embarrassed to say the word brain or mind. We're not uncomfortable looking at a diagram of the parts of the brain. And when it comes to human sexuality, this is the only real sex organ. It's the only part of a person's body that can consent. And now this is really important. It's so important that I'm going to be sure I say it 3 times before I'm finished. If you have no interest in a person's mind, you have no business touching that person's body. So sex is all in our heads, quite literally. Our brains are involved in every step of sexual behavior, from the desire to who we choose as a partner, arousal, orgasm, even post-coital cuddling. The real most enduring pleasure and satisfaction comes from the relationship and human connection. Think brains over genitals. And again, if you have no interest in another person's thoughts and feelings, you have no business touching their body. Meeting of the minds before meeting of the bodies. Even though we're not particularly prepared to talk about sex, it is all around us. There is nothing about that voluptuous woman with a Hardee's bag between her legs holding up a juicy burger that makes me want to eat at Hardee's. Quite the opposite. Actually, I'm not their target audience. But the point is, sex sells. It sells everything from sandwiches and shoes to clothes and cologne. And sometimes it's hard to distinguish mainstream advertising from soft porn. Look at these 2 magazine covers. If you couldn't see Playboy and Sports Illustrated on the covers, you wouldn't know the difference. And the media objectifies women who have distinguished themselves professionally. Look at these Sports Illustrated covers. When Derek Jeter was Sportsman of the Year, you didn't have to follow baseball to know he was a baseball player. When Peyton Manning was Sportsman of the Year, it's obvious from the cover that he's a football player. But what happens when we have a sports person instead of a sportsman? What sport do you think Serena Williams plays? Doesn't matter. We're not looking at her as an athlete, even when we acknowledge her tremendous athletic ability and achievement. Instead, we turn her into a sex toy because men aren't particularly interested in women athletics. Real athletes are men. But Serena's hot, so we could name her Sports Person of the Year and put her on the cover. That sells some magazines. Not as many as the swimsuit edition, but maybe as many as the typical Sportsman of the Year cover sells. Do all men think this? Of course not. But this is what sells. And these are the messages we all got growing up. It's not just women that are objectified, but women have traditionally been more exploited and disempowered. I show you this slide just to say exploiting or objectifying all genders equally is not the solution. And anyway, most of the ads sexually objectifying women would be a joke if you replace the woman with a man. Maybe not the salad guy. But again, objectifying men equally does nothing to address the real imbalance of power and exploitation of women. And when it comes to sexual experience, our society treats men and women very differently. Think about the importance society places on virginity for women versus virginity for men. How do you define virgin?
Send me the
Most people say someone who has never had sex. Everybody nods and we think we all agree on the definition. But what counts as sex? Is it only sexual intercourse? If so, then are all gay and lesbian people virgins? What about phone sex or masturbation or meeting up in a chat room or as virtual characters in a game and getting it on? Does sex include sexual assault? I've had cases where parents were actually relieved to learn that their daughters were anally assaulted rather than vaginally assaulted because at least she's still a virgin. I had cases where brothers and cousins had anal and oral sex, assaulting their younger sisters and cousins because they didn't want to ruin them for their husband someday. And the idea that human beings could be ruined for a future spouse seemed only to apply to girls, not boys. So when it comes to what is sex, as far as I'm concerned, any sexual act that can transmit a sexual infection would count as having sex, even if you wear a condom. But I no longer buy into the myth of virginity. Virginity is not a physical or a medical condition. It's a social construct left over from the days when the only way to ensure that the children a woman bore were for a man to marry a virgin and to keep her away from every other man. Keep in mind that when the United States of America was formed, women weren't included in We the People. Women and children were property, and a man could pretty much do whatever he liked with his own property. It was only when he started messing around with another man's woman or child that the act was considered criminal, the same way as if he damaged any other property that belonged to another male citizen. And if an unmarried man raped an unmarried woman, then the answer was for that man to marry the woman, make an honest woman of her, and ensure that any children born were legitimate. Whether or not a woman consented was really irrelevant. And there are still places in the world where a woman who has been raped, no matter how hard she resisted, will be put to death to preserve the family honor. That's how really destructive this myth of virginity and the idea of valuing a girl or a woman based upon virginity can be. Who wants gum that's already been chewed or sneakers that have already been worn? In many abstinence-only states, that is still what we're teaching our children. So here are some common beliefs that simply are not true. I've had doctors and nurses on cases that were operating under these false assumptions. Assumptions like the hymen is broken and bleeds during first intercourse or penetration, or that a doctor can examine female genitalia to determine whether the girl or woman is still a virgin, or that girls sometimes injure their hymen through sports, horseback riding, or gymnastics without even knowing it. Well, the truth is, a doctor can't examine female genitalia to determine whether a girl or woman is a virgin any more than they can examine male genitalia to make that determination. I don't know, maybe you've heard these things, or maybe you're already better informed than most, but the hymen is protected by the labia minora and the labia majora. Is it possible to injure your hymen during sports? It is, but a girl is no more likely to injure her hymen playing sports than she is, or any boy is, likely to injure their anus. And if that injury occurs, the athlete and everyone watching are going to know it immediately, because it's going to be a serious penetrating or separating injury. So in Fort Wayne, Indiana, where I worked, was one of the first places in the world to make sexual assault nurse examiners immediately available 24/7 to all victims of sexual assault. And I've worked with the chief nursing officer there, Michelle Denton, for more than 20 years. And we've done local, state, national, even international trainings for the professionals who work in the area of sexual assault. So we finally decided to write a book that we could use in our trainings and that would provide the basic information people need to understand what happens in sexual assault cases. So this is the book, The ABCs of Sexual Assault, Anatomy, Bunk, and the Courtroom. And the information that I'm sharing with you today comes primarily from the chapters on bunk, because we spend a lot of time every day debunking these medical and social myths. So, in fact, if you go to my website, www.socraticparenting.com, which Sarah said she put in the messages, that you can watch you can watch a training video that I did for the National Criminal Justice Training Center on the 10 myths of sexual assault. And there's a second link there for a training I did called Teaching Children About Consent. They're both about an hour long and they're both free. The book is available online. Prosecutors, judges, teachers, Title IX offices, child welfare workers, doctors and nurses, victim advocates, even defense attorneys are buying the book and finding it helpful. So the anatomy part of the book is what explains that everything down there on a female is not the vagina, and that most of the myths and the bunk come from the importance patriarchal societies have placed on the hymen. So when I do these professional trainings with Michelle, she, as a nurse, always does a little Hymenology 101, and I'm just going to give you some of the high points here. Like the hymen doesn't seal off the vagina the way that foil seals the top of a Tylenol bottle. It's a collar, and it can open it can open wide enough to insert a tampon or a speculum without injury. And there are documented cases of babies being born without any injury to the hymen. So not with conception and not even when the baby's head and shoulders went through. So the hymen can be injured, but it's never popped or broken. Once a girl matures enough to produce estrogen and go through puberty, that estrogen makes the hymen stretchy, kind of like a scrunchie, one of those elastic scrunchies you can put in your hair, and it can fold in on itself and look like there's no hole there, but there is. So any female who started her period should be able to insert a tampon without causing any injury. And if the hymen is injured, it's very vascular, it heals very quickly. So enough of Hymenology 101, but these misconceptions about female anatomy and myths about virginity, combined with the sexualization and objectification of women in general, are behind what has come to be known as rape culture. The phrase was coined about 50 years ago to explain how society shames and blames victims of sexual assault and normalizes male sexual violence. Rape culture is a complex set of beliefs that encourage male sexual aggression and end up supporting violence against women. Rape culture is the images, language, jokes, even the laws we live with every day that validate and perpetuate rape. We start to believe that it's normal, just the way things are. And as long as we keep thinking that and accepting that, the more likely your children and grandchildren are to grow up with it too. And this may be a good place to say, most men are not rapists, but most rapists are men. And women are not the only victims, but women are not the only victims, but most victims are women or children. So I say he and she, sometimes I say he as a perpetrator, she as a victim, and we end up doing that in English just to keep it clear so I don't have to keep saying he or she or they. But it's really not about sex or gender. Sexual assault, in the end, is all about power. We'll look at a power wheel in a little bit. So instead of learning about and practicing consent when we were kids, most of us learned to blame victims and excuse offenders. She wanted it. If she didn't want it, she asked for it. It wasn't really rape. It wasn't a big deal. He didn't mean to. She's lying. He is not a rapist. He's not deviant. So whatever he did couldn't be rape. The most basic message our culture sends to a man is that women want to be pursued, and everything they do is intended to arouse men and seduce them. If they fight you, they're just playing hard to get, to stoke your male hunger. That's not rape. Rape is an ugly guy in an alley with a knife. That's what a rapist looks like. I've been doing this work for decades now, so most of these media messages have been familiar to me and unsurprising. But the one that really got my attention when I first read this article from 2016 was how telling kids that all sex outside of marriage is wrong removes consent from the equation entirely. So whether my partner wants it or not, it's wrong either way. So it really doesn't matter that my partner isn't as enthusiastic about it as I am. In fact, I may admire my partner's virtue in resisting and putting up a bit of a fight to earn my respect and keep my interest. This is actually required teaching in 19 states, that all sex out of heterosexual marriage is morally wrong. And the message that this sends to young men, especially young men, is that you're sinning regardless of your partner's consent, so you might as well just go for it. And the message to young women is you're going to lose your virginity. If you're going to lose it, you might as well relax and enjoy it. This is so outrageous to me, but I've heard people say it, and I've watched other people nodding their agreement. It's so insidious and persistent, but our culture perpetuates it. In Hollywood, all a man who wants a particular woman has to do is assault that woman so she'll realize that she totally wants him too. Harrison Ford is one of my favorite actors, and I love watching Disney Pixar films, or I did with my daughter when she was growing up. But the messages Hollywood is sending to our children and young adults, really not what we want to teach them about consent. Take Star Wars. Princess Leia has told Han Solo at every opportunity that she's not interested in him. But he finds her alone, comes up behind her, presses his body against hers. She's strong. She shoves him off, but he's undeterred. She tells him, stop that. And stop that again, very clearly, very assertively, but he doesn't stop. Instead, romantic music plays. And he backs her into a corner until her head is pressed up against a metal wall and he kisses her. Or how about Indiana Jones in the Temple of Doom? There's a scene where Miriam is running away and Indy snatches her with his whip and yanks her back to him. And what happens? They fall in love. Or how about Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade? There's a scene where Indy forces a kiss on a woman who pulls away and says, how dare you kiss me? Before she pulls him back and kisses him passionately. And it's not just Harrison Ford, it's everywhere. All a real man has to do to make a woman realize how much she loves him and wants him and can't live without him is to force himself on her. Sure, she might resist at first, but deep down, we all know she wants it. Even in Ratatouille, there's a scene where Remy forces a kiss on a girl and she pulls out pepper spray to fight him off, but then realizes she loves it. This is what we grew up being taught about consent. These are really harmful messages. We say boys will be boys, normalizing aggressive behavior, objectification, even violence. We say, what did she expect? Boys only want one thing, sex. How could she think it was anything but a hookup? Seriously, did she think he actually liked her or had any interest in her as a person or in friendship or a relationship? She should know that if she says yes to dinner, a movie, ice cream, anything, he's going to want something in exchange. He's going to expect something. She owes it to him, especially if he spent money on her. A nice girl would never have gone off with him thinking that all he wanted to do was talk. And from his point of view, isn't it easier to ask for forgiveness if I've gone too far than to ask for permission? Especially when we all know she's supposed to say no, even if she really does want to say yes. So not only do we not teach teens about consent, we teach them assertive communication skills. In my community, Fort Wayne, students go to a health center to learn about sexual reproduction and dating relationships. So when my daughter was in 8th grade, she came home and talked to me about what they learned. She told me how the girls were taught to say no firmly and assertively. And then they all watched this movie about a guy and a girl who liked each other and went to the zoo together. They had fun, but at the end of it all, the boy puts the moves on the girl, and she assertively told him no and made him stop. So I asked my daughter, did you talk at all about what the boy could have done to let the girl know that he liked her instead of just putting the moves on her? And she said, well, the girls didn't talk about that at all, and she was pretty sure the boys didn't either. I asked her, did you talk about what the girl should do if she did like the boy and wanted to kiss him back? Maybe even wanted to see what it would feel like if he touched her. And again, the answer was no. They didn't talk about that at all. And here's the really disturbing part. The girl is supposed to say no, even if she really wants to say yes. This is an incredibly dangerous message. And I'm pretty sure it wasn't lost on the boys either. A girl says no because she's supposed to. So you don't have to stop if you think she likes you. And every hormone in your body is screaming that she wants you. So she's going to have to do a lot more than say no. She's going to have to convince him that she means it when he's not actually even listening to what she's saying. We may say no means no, but that is not what we're teaching kids when we're instructing them in assertive communication. And if this is what's being taught in middle school, is it any wonder that 1 in 5 girls and 1 in 17 boys will be forced or coerced into having sex by the time they're in high school and college? And especially if you start adding alcohol or other mind-altering substances to the mix. At its very core, sexual and intimate partner violence isn't about miscommunication. It's not even about sex. It's about power and control. So the violence is a bright line for most of us. And you can see that violence on the wheel on the outside edge. But even before physical or sexual violence, there are many red flags to say this is controlling and manipulative behavior. This is not love, and it goes much deeper than just a disagreement or angry moment. Look at the wheel. Someone who is isolated, intimidated, threatened, and controlled is not in a position to give genuine consent. So when we first defined consent as agreement or permission, I told you that consent requires capacity, action, and relationship. Assuming the person you are dating or even just want to hook up with is old enough to legally consent, we still have to consider that person's competence to consent. Do they have all of the necessary information to understand what they're consenting to? And are they conscious, awake, and aware of what's being asked of them? Because consent is an action. It's active, not passive. It's agreeing and giving permission and doing it freely, without force, coercion, or deception. Consent is also a noun, something that must be given by one person to another person. And anytime you have an action involving 2 people, you have to understand the relationship between those 2 people. For there to be consent, there has to be an element of mutual respect between the parties. And there has to be that meeting of the minds. We like to think of consent as an enthusiastic yes with active, ongoing participation. And we like to think of non-consent as an emphatic no with active, ongoing resistance. But most of our lives and most of our relationships operate somewhere between those 2 extremes. In fact, we human beings are very social creatures. We spend most of our lives inside that gray box where we want other people's yes to be a promise that can't be rescinded and their no to be negotiable. Maybe not yet, but if I'm persistent and relentless, how could you possibly tell me no? And surprisingly, sometimes the more you resist, the more I seem to want it, because it's suddenly become a test of my resolve or my ability to control you and get what I want. Or it may all depend on how invested I am in our relationship. The more I care about you, the more I might be willing to negotiate. The more I think you care about me, the more I think your yes should be a promise. The biggest reason consent can be so challenging when it comes to relationships is that we all have our own inconsistencies and uncertainties. And so if we're not even sure within ourselves sometimes, how can we communicate that clearly to another person? So the title was The Difference Between No Means No and Yes Means Yes. So what is that difference? Far too many rape statutes require a defendant to use force or threaten bodily injury in order for a sexual assault to be a crime. And so these are no means no states. Indiana is one, where the consent of the victim is completely irrelevant as long as the victim is old enough to consent and conscious. Sexual predators can presume that the answer is yes until their victim says no and forcefully resists. And remember, most victims know they're rapists and have no idea that they are being manipulated, isolated, and groomed for assault. So when someone you thought was your friend won't take no for an answer, that person physically attacks you. The most common human response is fear. And we don't get to choose which hormones our body releases when we're afraid. It could be adrenaline and cortisol that throws us into a fight and flight mode. Or it could be frozen fright, a flood of dopamine or oxytocin or something that causes us to shut down and play possum until the danger passes. If the law presumes that the answer is yes until she says no and means it, then frozen fright doesn't require the use of force. No force, no crime. So the only hormonal response from fear that makes for a good rape case is fight. And that is the most dangerous because you're provoking your attacker to use force with no guarantee of how much force will ultimately be used. Sexual assault is the only crime like this. We all know you can't take somebody's wallet or car without permission, but so many of our laws still do more to protect a man's property and a man's reputation than to protect the physical well-being of women and children. So what we need are yes means yes statutes, where every person has to presume that no one wants to have sex with them without a clear communication of desire and specific intent. You should assume that I don't want you taking my money from my wallet, driving off in my car, or touching my body, unless we've talked about it very specifically. If I let you borrow my car on one occasion, doesn't make it yours to use whenever you want. So I have a daughter who's 20 now. She's a sophomore at Indiana University. And I was doing this kind of work even before she was born. So the sex education she received at home was quite different from what she got at school and from what most of her friends got, except maybe from what they got from her. But as she was growing up, there were 3 videos that I had her watch. We don't have time to watch them together today, but they're really easy to find online. And I would encourage you all to watch them on your own or watch them with your friends. So most people in Indiana would tell you that the legal age of consent is 16. It's actually 14. When a child turns 14, she's old enough to consent to all sexual activity up to and including intercourse with any other person who is 14, 15, 16, or 17 years old. So when my daughter turned 14, I had her watch this TED Talk by Al Vernaccio. It's called Sex Needs a New Metaphor. So Mr. Vernaccio is a teacher in this little Quaker school just outside of Philadelphia. He does an amazing job of instructing students on human sexuality. This video lasts about 8 minutes, definitely worth your time. He talks about how we use baseball as a metaphor for sex and how aggressive, competitive, sexist, and heterosexist that is. It's worth thinking about. I mean, baseball has rules about how you play, what you play, who gets to play. And every baseball game has a winner and a loser. So Mr. Vernaccio recommends pizza as a new metaphor. And when my daughter turned 16, I introduced her to John Oliver. Now, if you like John Oliver and you're not afraid to take a humorous look at the real issues we face with sex education, then check out this segment. So it is John Oliver. You have to expect some profanity and reverence, but it lasts about 21 minutes. And again, totally worth your time. So especially around the 14-minute mark, when Elizabeth Smart, who was kidnapped at age 14 and raped repeatedly, she talks about being taught that she was like a piece of chewed gum that no one would ever want. Or around the 15-minute mark, when they start talking about consent, and John Oliver compares sex without consent to boxing without consent, right? So even a boxer, you can't just walk up and slug or punch a boxer. If you do that without the boxer's consent, without being there in the arena, it's a crime. It's battery, assault. So my daughter didn't get to see this John Oliver one until she was in high school. And then when she turned 18, I introduced her to Peggy Orenstein. And Peggy has a TED Talk entitled What Young Women Believe About Their Own Sexual Pleasure. No one talks to girls about their own sexual pleasure. And the effect of this silence is a huge void that's being filled by pop culture and pornography that tells girls they're supposed to be sexy and perform sexually for boys, and it causes boys to expect this from girls. Girls are being taught to please their partners without regard to their own desires. And the primary place we're seeing this is in the prevalence of oral sex and the hookup culture that treats casual sex as the pathway to a relationship instead of developing a relationship based on trust and mutual respect that can lead to sexual intimacy. I'm not advocating one-night stands, but I'm not judging them either. I'm saying regardless of the length of the relationship, whatever happens needs to be consensual, and the pleasure needs to be mutual. There needs to be balance and equality. And so in contrast to the power and control wheel I showed you earlier, Duluth has also developed the equality wheel. Simply refraining from violence, force, coercion, and intimidation isn't enough. To develop a healthy, mutually fulfilling relationship, there has to be mutual respect, honesty, accountability, and trust. So let me say this a third time, because if you take one thing from our time together today, let it be this. The brain is the only part of the body that is capable of giving consent. There has to be a meeting of the minds before there's any meeting of the body parts. If you're not interested in engaging a person's mind, then you have no business touching that person's body. And what I told my daughter is, if you're too embarrassed to talk with someone about what you want to do, maybe you're not really ready to do it. Sexual intimacy, especially in a hookup, requires safety. A strong, safe relationship is best. You can't expect the other person to read your mind or for that person to know what you want and don't want. Sex is an ongoing conversation. The communication doesn't have to be verbal, but it does have to be active and ongoing. If your partner becomes non-responsive, you have to stop. Check in. Make sure you're both on the same page and that you both want the same things. That's consent. And if the other person falls asleep or passes out, you're done. You don't have any right to use another person's body while they're out of it. And I should probably also say sexual arousal is not sexual consent. A person who is sexually aroused can still say no to sex and mean it. And every yes is limited to that specific action in that specific moment. Both people have the right to disengage whenever they no longer want to participate. I'll go back to the baseball metaphor. If I agree to play catch with you, I'm allowed to stop when I'm tired, even if you want to keep playing. And agreeing to play catch doesn't mean I've agreed to pitch the ball to you and let you hit it back at me with a bat. I may be completely happy playing catch for an hour, even if you want to switch to batting practice. And you can't make me pitch the ball to you. And you don't get to come and hit me with a baseball bat if I refuse to pitch the ball to you. Anyway, I get to choose what I agree to do, and so do you. So that brings us back to the shared values we talked about at the very beginning. These are the values we share as a community. We expect them of ourselves, our professors, our classmates. They are even more critical in our most intimate relationships, whether it's for a lifetime or just one night. We value each other, respect the unique dignity of every person, and communicate with honesty and integrity.